On the morning of March 14th, 1849, the last thing Ezra Crenshaw owned was taken from him. It wasn't much. A canvas rucksack with a change of clothes, a folding knife his mother had given him before the cholera took her, and a leather-bound copy of Walden he'd found in a church donation box the previous autumn. His stepfather, Harold Pruitt, had married Ezra's mother when Ezra was 11, and for 5 years the man had tolerated the boy the way a person tolerates a stone in their boot. Now that Ezra's mother was in the ground behind the Baptist church in Harlan, Kentucky, there was no reason to pretend anymore. "You're not mine," Harold said from the porch, not even bothering to stand from his rocker. He was cleaning his fingernails with a whittling blade, flicking the dirt onto the boards. "Never were. Your mother's gone. God rest her. And I got my own boys to feed. You're 16. Old enough." Ezra stood in the muddy yard, the March wind cutting through his wool coat. He didn't argue. He'd learned years ago that arguing with Harold was like trying to reason with a fence post. It wouldn't move, and you'd only tire yourself out. Harold's 2 sons, Dale and Emmett, watched from the doorway with expressions that fell somewhere between relief and satisfaction. They were 14 and 12, but already they'd absorbed their father's particular talent for cruelty. Dale had once drowned a barn cat in a rain barrel while Emmett kept lookout. Neither had ever opened a book that wasn't forced upon them. "I'll be going then," Ezra said. Harold grunted. "See that you do. And don't come back thinking you're owed something. Your mother didn't leave nothing but debts." That was a lie. Ezra's mother, Catherine Crenshaw, had owned 40 acres of land on the eastern slope of Black Mountain, land her own father had homesteaded in the 1820s. Ezra had seen the deed once, tucked into the family Bible, but the Bible was inside the house, and the house belonged to Harold now, and the law in Harlan County moved at the speed of whoever had more friends at the courthouse. Ezra was 16, parentless, and had no friends at the courthouse. He turned and walked down the track toward the main road, his boots squelching in the red Kentucky mud. Behind him, Dale called out something about how the runt was finally leaving. Emmett laughed. Ezra didn't look back. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. He walked for 3 days. Not aimlessly, Ezra had a destination, though he couldn't have explained to anyone why he felt pulled toward it. His grandfather, Amos Crenshaw, had told him stories before the old man passed, stories about the eastern hollows of Black Mountain, where coal companies had punched exploratory shafts into the hillsides in the 1830s and then abandoned them when the seams ran too thin to profit from. Holes in the mountain, his grandfather had called them, like God started something and forgot to finish. One shaft in particular had fascinated Amos. It sat at the head of a narrow valley the locals called Blind Hollow, accessible only by a creek bed that wound between laurel thickets so dense a man had to turn sideways to pass through. The mining company, Eastern Kentucky Coal and Mineral, long since dissolved, had driven the shaft nearly 200 feet into the mountainside before giving up. But Amos had explored it once as a young man and found something the miners hadn't cared about. "Warm," his grandfather had whispered, his eyes bright with the memory. "Warm as a kitchen in there, boy, even in January. And the deeper you went, the warmer it got. Something in that mountain's alive, I tell you." Ezra had been 8 years old when he heard that story. He'd never forgotten it. The 3 days of walking were hard. He slept the first night under a rock overhang beside Cranks Creek, wrapped in his coat, shivering until dawn painted the ridgeline pink. The second night, he found a hay barn with an unlocked door and burrowed into the loose straw like an animal, waking with stalks in his hair and a hunger that gnawed at his ribs. He ate what he could forage. A handful of dried persimmons still clinging to a tree beside the road, watercress from a creek bank, and a half-rotten apple he found in a ditch. It wasn't enough, but it was something. On the third morning, the sky opened and rain came down in cold silver sheets. Ezra walked through it, his coat soaked through, his teeth chattering, following his grandfather's directions from memory. Past the split oak, along the south fork of Crank's Creek, through the laurel hell where the water ran clear over limestone. By afternoon, the rain had turned to sleet, and Ezra's fingers were numb, and the voice in his head that said, "Keep walking," was getting quieter. He found Blind Hollow as the last light drained from the sky. The entrance to the mine shaft was half hidden by a collapse of loose rock and a curtain of Virginia creeper, but it was there, a dark mouth in the hillside, perhaps 6 feet high and 5 feet wide, with rusted iron rails emerging from the darkness and disappearing into the weeds. Ezra stood before it. He was hungry. He'd eaten almost nothing in 3 days. His feet were blistered, and his coat was still soaked from the sleet. The March evening was settling toward freezing, and his body shook with a chill that went deeper than skin. He lit the stub of a tallow candle from his rucksack and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a different quality of quiet. The hush of enclosed stone, heavy and still, like the mountain was holding its breath. His candle flame barely flickered. The air was cool near the entrance, perhaps 50 degrees, but within 30 steps it changed. A gentle warmth pressed against his face, soft as a hand. By the time he'd walked 100 feet into the shaft, following the rusted rails, the temperature had risen to something remarkable. The air felt like a mild spring evening, 60 degrees, perhaps 65. Ezra pressed his palm against the stone wall. It was warm, not hot, not dramatic, but unmistakably warm, as though the rock itself had been sitting in sunlight all afternoon. But there was no sunlight here. There hadn't been sunlight here for millions of years. He explored further. The main shaft continued straight for another 100 feet before ending in a rubble face where the miners had abandoned their work. But along the way, 2 lateral passages branched off. Natural fissures the miners had widened for exploration. The left passage ran about 40 feet before narrowing to a crack. The right passage opened into a broader chamber, perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched 12 feet overhead. Water seeped down one wall, pooling in a natural basin before draining through a crack in the floor. In this chamber, the temperature was extraordinary. Ezra guessed 70 degrees, though he had no thermometer. The air was moist and clean, carrying a faint mineral scent, not unpleasant like wet slate after rain. The walls were pale limestone streaked with iron oxide, and in the candlelight they glowed with a warm amber luminescence. Ezra set down his rucksack, spread his wet coat on a flat rock to dry in the warmth, and lay down on the stone floor. For the first time in 3 days, for the first time perhaps since his mother's death, he felt warm. The mountain held him the way his mother once had, and the warmth was real, and it asked nothing of him in return. He slept for 14 hours. The first weeks were about survival in its most basic form. Ezra had the knife, the candle stubs, his wits, and the wilderness. He'd grown up rural and poor, which meant he knew how to set snares for rabbits, how to identify edible plants, how to build a fire that burned slow and hot rather than fast and wasteful. But living in an abandoned mine shaft presented challenges that no amount of country upbringing had prepared him for. Light was the first problem. Candles were finite, and he had no money to buy more. For the first week, he spent his daylight hours outside, foraging, snaring, exploring the hollow, and retreated to the mine only to sleep. But rain and cold drove him inside for longer stretches, and he needed to see. He solved this temporarily by making rushlights, peeled rushes dipped in whatever animal fat he could render from his snares. They smoked terribly and gave poor light, but they burned, and that was enough. Water was the second concern, but the mountain solved this for him. The seepage in the main chamber was constant and clean, filtered through hundreds of feet of limestone. He tested it cautiously, sipping small amounts over several days, and found it sweet and mineral-rich, better than any well water he'd ever tasted. The natural basin held about 3 gallons at any time, and it refilled steadily. He fashioned a wooden cup from a section of poplar branch, hollowing it with his knife over the course of 2 evenings. Food was the ongoing challenge. Blind Hollow was remote, which meant game was relatively abundant. Rabbits, squirrels, the occasional grouse. He found a grove of hickory trees half a mile downstream and gathered nuts by the sackful. He located pawpaw trees along the creek, their custard-like fruit a luxury he hadn't expected. But hunting and gathering consumed most of his daylight hours and provided only subsistence. He was leaner each week, his belt notched tighter, his cheekbones sharper against his skin. Some mornings he woke with a dizziness that told him his body was consuming itself, and he'd lie still in the warm dark, waiting for the strength to stand. It was during the 4th week, in mid-April, that Ezra made an observation that would change everything. He'd been storing some of his foraged food inside the mine, hickory nuts in a crevice, strips of dried rabbit on a flat rock, a handful of ramp bulbs he dug from a hillside. The ramps had been sitting on a damp stone near the seepage wall for about a week, forgotten in the back of the chamber. When Ezra finally noticed them, he expected them to be shriveled or rotten. They were growing. The bulbs had sent out pale green shoots, each one 3 or 4 inches long, reaching toward nothing in the warm, moist darkness. Ezra crouched beside them and stared. He'd seen potatoes sprout in a root cellar before, but this was different. These shoots were vigorous, healthy-looking, and the chamber was completely dark. He sat with this for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind, the way he turned interesting stones in his palm. Plants needed light to grow. Everyone knew that. But these ramps were growing without light, feeding off the energy stored in their bulbs. The question was how long they could sustain that growth, and whether the warm, moist environment of the mine might extend it. Over the next several days, Ezra conducted experiments with the methodical patience that would come to define his life's work. He planted ramp bulbs at various depths in the soil-filled cracks along the chamber floor. He buried hickory nuts in pockets of clay near the seepage wall. He took a wild potato he dug from a forest clearing and cut it into sections, each with an eye, and nestled them into the damp earth along the mine's entrance, where some daylight penetrated. Then he waited, and he watched. The mine became his laboratory. He had no formal education in botany or geology, but he had something that many educated men lacked: the patience to observe without forcing conclusions, and the humility to let the mountain teach him. He began keeping a journal, scratching notes onto flat pieces of shale with a sharpened nail he'd found in the mine's debris. When he eventually acquired paper and a pencil, months later, he transferred these observations into a record that would survive for over a century. What he discovered, through weeks of careful watching, was this: the mine's environment was uniquely suited to growing certain types of plants. The constant temperature, he would later determine it averaged 68 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, eliminated the killing frosts that destroyed crops above ground. The humidity, hovering near 90%, kept soil moist without waterlogging. The mineral-rich seepage provided nutrients that supplemented the thin mountain soil, and while deep darkness prevented most green growth, the transitional zone near the mine's entrance, where diffused daylight penetrated 30 to 40 feet, supported a surprising range of plants. More importantly, the mine's warmth extended the growing season to something previously unimaginable: 12 months. By June of 1849, Ezra had established what he called his first garden, a modest plot in the entrance zone of the mine where daylight was sufficient for leafy greens. He'd carried bucket after bucket of forest soil from the hollow, mixing it with decomposed leaf litter and the calcium-rich clay from inside the mine. In this bed, no more than 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, he grew lettuce, ramps, and a species of shade-tolerant cress he'd transplanted from the creek bank. It wasn't much, but it was food he hadn't hunted, food that grew reliably, food that was waiting for him when he came home, rather than requiring hours of pursuit through the woods. For a 16-year-old living alone in an abandoned mine, it was a revolution. Through the summer, he expanded. He cleared the rubble from the mine entrance, widening it to allow more light penetration. He built a crude wooden frame, a cold frame in reverse, designed not to protect plants from cold, but to channel daylight deeper into the shaft. Using a piece of broken mirror he found at an old campsite downstream, he experimented with reflecting sunlight around corners and off the pale limestone walls. The results were imperfect, but encouraging. By August, his growing zone extended nearly 50 feet into the mine, and he had added turnips, beets, and a variety of bean that seemed to tolerate the low light conditions. He also began to understand the mine's thermal dynamics more fully. The warmth, he reasoned, came from the earth itself, the deep geology of Black Mountain conducting heat upward through the rock. He didn't know the term geothermal gradient, but he was observing its effects with precision. He noted that the temperature increased as he went deeper, reaching 75 degrees at the shaft's terminus. He noted that the airflow followed a predictable pattern. Warm air rose from the depths and flowed outward through the entrance, creating a gentle, constant draft that he came to think of as the mine breathing. In winter, this breathing would prove critical. The warm air flowing outward would prevent freezing temperatures from penetrating more than a few feet past the entrance. The mine breathed, and in its breath was life. Word began to trickle into the scattered settlements of Harlan County that young Ezra Crenshaw was living in an old mine shaft on Black Mountain like some kind of animal. The reactions were predictable. Some people pitied him. More laughed. A few expressed concern to the circuit preacher, who hiked up to Blind Hollow one afternoon in July to check on the boy's welfare and sanity. Reverend Thomas Asbury found Ezra sitting on a flat rock outside the mine entrance, reading his battered copy of Walden in the afternoon light, with a small fire burning and a rabbit roasting on a spit. The boy was thinner than Asbury remembered, but his eyes were clear and his manner was calm. Inside the mine, the Reverend saw the sleeping area, a raised platform of stacked stone covered with pine boughs and a deerskin, and the garden, which startled him. "You're growing vegetables in a mine?" Asbury asked. "Yes, sir." "In the dark?" "Not entirely dark. There's enough light near the front, and the temperature never drops below 65, even in the dead of winter. My grandfather told me about that." The Reverend studied the boy for a long moment. "Your stepfather says you ran off, says you're welcome to come home." Ezra said nothing to that. They both knew it wasn't true, and they both knew it didn't matter. Asbury left with a handful of the freshest lettuce he'd tasted outside of summer, and he didn't tell anyone about the garden. but he began stopping by every few weeks, bringing small gifts, a pouch of salt, a box of matches, and once, a copy of a farming almanac that Ezra read cover to cover 3 times. The first winter was the proving ground. By October of 1849, Ezra had 7 months of preparation behind him and a deep, bone-level understanding of what the mountain could offer. He'd stockpiled dried meat, nuts, and preserved greens. He'd expanded his underground garden to include root vegetables stored in the deeper chambers where the temperature held steady. He'd sealed the mine entrance with a wall of stacked logs and clay, leaving a door-sized opening covered with a heavy deerskin flap. The wall blocked wind and trapped the mine's warmth while still allowing the gentle outward airflow to continue. When the first hard frost hit Harlan County on November 2nd, the hollows and ridges turned white and the creeks began to ice. Above ground, temperatures plunged to 20 degrees, then 10, then below 0 during a bitter cold snap in late December. Farmers lost crops. Livestock froze in barns. 2 elderly residents of the county died of exposure. Inside Ezra's mine, the temperature in the main chamber held at 67 degrees. He recorded this in his journal with the careful precision that was becoming his hallmark. November 15th. Outside temperature approximately 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber temperature 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Seepage continues. Lettuce growing. December 29th. Harshest cold yet, estimated below 0. Chamber steady at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Turnips mature and sweet. Air coming from depths remains warm. January 4th, 1850. Snow depth outside approximately 14 inches. Inside, comfortable in shirt sleeves. The mine was not merely a shelter. It was an incubator, a greenhouse powered not by glass and coal, but by the ancient heat of the earth itself. While every garden in Harlan County lay dormant under snow and ice, Ezra Crenshaw was eating fresh greens. The loneliness was harder than the cold had ever been. December nights stretched long inside the mountain, and though the air was warm, the silence had a weight to it that pressed against his chest. He missed his mother with a sharpness that surprised him. Not the vague ache of the first months, but specific, piercing memories. The way she hummed while kneading bread, the smell of her hair when she bent to kiss him goodnight, the sound of her voice reading to him from the Bible on winter evenings, her finger tracing the words, teaching him to read before he was old enough to understand why it mattered. She had given him that. Literacy, curiosity, the belief that a person could learn anything if they were patient enough. Harold Pruitt had tried to take it away, but you can't take away what's been planted in the mind. It grows in the dark, like ramps in a warm mine. On Christmas Day, 1849, Ezra ate a meal of roasted rabbit, boiled turnips from his garden, watercress, and hickory nuts. He ate it alone, sitting at the flat rock that served as his table by the light of a single rush lamp. He said grace, not from habit or belief exactly, but because his mother had always said grace, and saying the words made her feel close. Then he opened his Walden and read until the lamp sputtered out, and he slept in the warm dark, and the mountain held him. He spent the winter months refining his growing systems. He built terraced beds from stacked limestone, creating shelves that caught the maximum diffused light from the entrance. He developed a method of rotating his mirror reflectors throughout the day to follow the sun's angle, extending useful light deeper into the shaft. He experimented with sprouting, growing beans, lentils, and wheatgrass in complete darkness, producing nutritious food that required no light at all. He discovered that mushrooms thrived in the mine's deeper passages, and by inoculating fallen logs with spores he collected from the forest, he established a mushroom crop that would produce year-round for decades. He also spent long evenings reading by the light of his rush lamps. Walden he had nearly memorized, but the farming almanac opened new corridors of thought. He read about crop rotation, soil amendments, the chemistry of composting. He read about greenhouses in Europe, where wealthy men grew oranges under glass, and he thought about how his mine accomplished the same feat without a single pane. He read about the thermal properties of stone and understood for the first time in words rather than intuition why his mountain was warm. The earth's heat, rising through fractured rock, conducted into the limestone walls that surrounded him like the walls of a living furnace. He was not living in a hole. He was living inside the earth's own body, and it was keeping him alive. By spring of 1850, when the snow melted and the dogwoods bloomed in Blind Hollow, Ezra Crenshaw had done something that no one in Harlan County thought possible. He had not merely survived a Kentucky winter in an abandoned mine. He had eaten well through it, better in some ways than families with proper houses, wood stoves, and root cellars. He was 17 years old. The second year brought expansion and refinement. Ezra had spent his first months in pure survival mode, reacting to needs as they arose. Now he began to plan. He'd been thinking about light, the fundamental limitation of underground farming, and he devised a solution that was equal parts ingenuity and backbreaking labor. Over the summer of 1850, he dug what he called light wells, vertical shafts from the surface of the mountain down into the mine's lateral passages. Each light well was roughly 18 inches in diameter, angled to catch the southern sun, and lined with flat pieces of pale limestone to maximize reflection. The work was staggering for a single person. Each well required excavating through several feet of soil and then chipping through solid rock. He had only his knife, a hammer he'd traded for, 3 rabbit pelts at the general store in cranks, and an iron chisel he'd found in the mine's original debris. The first light well took him 6 weeks. He worked from both ends, digging down from the surface and chipping upward from the passage below, estimating the meeting point by counting paces and dropping stones to listen for echoes. Twice he miscalculated and had to abandon a shaft and start again. His hands bled. His shoulders ached so badly some mornings that he couldn't lift his arms above his head. But he kept at it, day after day, with the same patient persistence that had carried him through winter. The well broke through into the left lateral passage on August 10th, 1850, and when the morning sun hit it at the right angle, a beam of golden light lanced down into the mountain and illuminated a patch of floor like a spotlight on a stage. Ezra stood in the passage below, looking up at that beam, and felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't known was closed. Light, real, honest sunlight, reaching a place it hadn't touched in 300 million years. Since the limestone was a seafloor and the mountain was a dream the earth hadn't dreamed yet. He built 3 more light wells over the following months, each one faster than the last as his technique improved. The combined effect transformed the mine's growing potential. Where before he'd been limited to the entrance zone and complete darkness crops like mushrooms and sprouts, he now had pockets of direct sunlight deep inside the mountain. In these patches, he planted tomatoes, peppers, and squash, warm season crops that the mine's stable temperature could support even in winter, provided they had light. The results were extraordinary. His first underground tomatoes ripened in December of 1850, deep red and bursting with flavor, at a time when no tomato grew within 500 miles. He ate the first one sitting on a stone ledge in the main chamber, juice running down his chin, and laughed out loud, a sound that surprised him with its strangeness. He hadn't laughed in months. News of the mine garden spread slowly, the way all news traveled in the Kentucky hills, through chance encounters, general store gossip, and the observations of hunters who wandered too close to Blind Hollow and saw things they couldn't explain. A boy living in a hole in the mountain, vegetables growing in the dark, fresh tomatoes in December. Most people dismissed it as exaggeration or madness, but a few were curious, and in the spring of 1851, Ezra received his first visitor, who wasn't Reverend Asbury. His name was Dr. Lucius Marsh, a geologist from the University of Virginia who was surveying mineral deposits in the Cumberland Plateau. Marsh had heard the stories in Harlan, and being a man of science, decided to investigate rather than dismiss. He hiked up to Blind Hollow on a cool April morning and found Ezra working outside the mine entrance, transplanting seedlings from a nursery bed into wooden flats he'd built from salvaged timber. "You're the cave farmer?" Marsh asked. Ezra looked up. He was 18 now, lean and strong from 2 years of hard physical labor, with calloused hands and watchful dark eyes. "I farm in a mine," he said. "Not a cave. There's a difference." The distinction impressed Marsh. A cave was natural. A mine was human-made. The boy understood the difference between geology and engineering, even if he didn't use those words. What followed was a tour that lasted 5 hours. Marsh explored every passage, examined the light wells, tested the temperature at multiple points with his mercury thermometer, confirming 68 degrees in the main chamber, 72 in the deeper passages, and tasted the produce. He was particularly astonished by the mushroom logs, which were producing fat, healthy shiitakes in quantities that would have been impressive in a purpose-built mushroom house, let alone an abandoned mine. "Do you know what you've built here?" Marsh asked, sitting beside Ezra in the main chamber, his scientific composure giving way to genuine excitement. "A place to live," Ezra said. "You've built a geothermally regulated agricultural environment," Marsh said. "The Earth's internal heat maintains a constant temperature in these passages. Your light wells provide photosynthetically active radiation. The limestone seepage supplies calcium and trace minerals to the soil. You've essentially created a year-round greenhouse powered by the planet itself." Ezra considered this. "I just noticed it was warm and wet, and plants liked it." Marsh laughed. "That's how most great discoveries begin. Someone notices something and takes it seriously." The geologist stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the mine, which he pronounced the most comfortable lodging he'd experienced in 6 weeks of field work, and taking copious notes. Before he left, he gave Ezra 2 gifts: a proper journal with a leather cover and blank pages, and a standing offer to correspond. He also took samples of the mine's soil, water, and rock back to the university for analysis. The analysis, when it came back months later, in a letter that Ezra read and reread until the paper grew soft, confirmed what Marsh had suspected. The mine sat atop a geological formation that channeled geothermal heat from deep underground upward through a network of natural fissures in the limestone. The water that seeped through the walls was rich in calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, natural fertilizer. The stable temperature and humidity created conditions nearly identical to the cloud forests of Central America, where some of the world's most productive agriculture thrived. "You are sitting on one of the most unique natural growing environments in eastern North America," Marsh wrote. "I would encourage you to expand your experiments and keep meticulous records. Science is observation, and you are a natural scientist." Ezra was 18 years old, living alone in a hole in a mountain, and a University of Virginia professor had called him a scientist. He read the letter one more time, folded it carefully, and placed it in his journal. Then he went back to work. The years between 1851 and 1856 were years of building, in every sense of the word. Ezra expanded the mine systematically. He widened passages, reinforced unstable sections with timber framing, and excavated new chambers specifically for agriculture. He built stone-lined growing beds filled with his own soil mixture, forest loam, limestone clay, decomposed leaf matter, and the mineral-rich sediment from the seepage. He constructed a series of water channels that distributed the seepage across multiple growing areas, providing consistent irrigation without any mechanical pump. His crop diversity increased steadily. Through trade and correspondence, Marsh sent seeds from Virginia, and Ezra traded produce at the general store for varieties he couldn't find locally. He developed a collection of over 40 different plants growing underground: root vegetables, greens, herbs, mushrooms, beans, and even flowers. He grew medicinal plants, ginseng, golden seal, and black cohosh, that thrived in the mine's conditions and commanded high prices from traveling herbalists. The ginseng, in particular, became significant. Wild Appalachian ginseng was already prized, and the roots that Ezra grew in his mine's mineral-rich soil were notably large and well-formed. A single pound of dried ginseng root could fetch between $5 and $8 in 1853, enough to buy supplies for a month. Ezra began cultivating it deliberately, using the deepest chambers where the temperature was warmest and the light was dimmest, conditions that mimicked the shaded forest floor where ginseng grew naturally, but with the added benefit of year-round warmth and controlled moisture. By 1854, Ezra was no longer merely surviving. He was prospering. He had cash money, not much, but enough. He purchased proper tools: a pick, shovels, a saw, a hand drill. He bought fabric and sewing supplies, teaching himself to mend and eventually make clothing from patterns in a catalog Reverend Asbury brought him. He subscribed to a scientific journal, The American Agriculturist, that arrived monthly at the general store, and he read each issue with the hunger of a man who had been starving for knowledge. He also improved his living quarters substantially. The main chamber became a proper room, stone walls chinked with clay, a raised sleeping platform with a straw mattress, shelves for his growing library of books, a table and chair he'd built from cherry wood, and an oil lamp that cast warm light across surfaces that had known only darkness for eons. He built a second room adjacent to the main chamber, a workshop and storage space where he kept his tools, dried herbs, and preserves. He cooked on a small stone hearth near the entrance, where the natural draft carried smoke outward, and he ate meals that visitors would later describe as astonishingly varied for a man living alone in a mountain. The mine was no longer a shelter. It was a home. He met Clara Bergman in the autumn of 1856. She was 23, the daughter of German immigrants who had settled in a small community near Middlesbrough. Her father, Wilhelm, was a botanist by training, who had abandoned academic ambitions for farming when the family emigrated, and he'd raised Clara with a love of plants and a rigor of mind that was unusual for women in rural Kentucky. She could identify 200 species of Appalachian wildflowers by sight, read German and English with equal fluency, and had opinions about soil chemistry that she expressed without apology. She'd come to Blind Hollow because of a letter. Dr. Marsh had mentioned Ezra's mine garden in a lecture at a Botanical Society meeting in Lexington, and a report of the lecture had reached Wilhelm Bergman through a German-language scientific newsletter. Wilhelm was too ill to travel. His lungs were failing, a consequence of years of dusty farm work. But Clara was not. Ezra was working in his second light well garden when he heard footsteps in the main passage. He emerged to find a young woman standing in the main chamber, her traveling dress dusty, her brown hair pinned under a practical bonnet, examining his mushroom logs with an expression of intense interest. "Your inoculation technique is very good," she said, without introduction. "But you're spacing the plugs too far apart. You'd get better colonization at 3 inches rather than 5. Ezra blinked. No one had ever walked into his mine, and immediately corrected his mushroom cultivation. "I'm Clara Bergman," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes were hazel, direct, and completely unintimidated by the fact that she was standing inside a mountain talking to a stranger. "Dr. Marsh mentioned your work. I had to see it myself." The tour she demanded was even more thorough than Marsh's had been. She tested soil between her fingers, tasted the seepage water, examined root systems, and asked questions that Ezra had never been asked before. Questions about mycorrhizal networks, about the pH of his limestone-derived soil, about whether he'd noticed differential growth rates between his light well zones and his entrance garden. Half the terms she used were new to him. He found himself taking notes during his own tour. She stayed 3 days, sleeping in a camp she set up outside the mine entrance. Propriety demanded distance, even in the wilderness. During the days, they worked together in the underground gardens, and Ezra experienced something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. A companion who understood, not just someone who was impressed by what he'd built, but someone who grasped the principles behind it and could see where it might go next. "You need to try grafting," Clara told him on the second day, examining a wild apple tree that grew near the mine entrance. "If you could establish dwarf fruit trees in the entrance zone, the stable temperature would let you produce fruit year-round. In Germany, my father grew peaches in a heated greenhouse. Your mine is better than any greenhouse." When she left, she promised to return. Ezra watched her ride down the hollow on a borrowed mule and felt the silence of the mountain settle around him like a coat that no longer fit properly. She returned in November, bringing her father's grafting tools and a collection of scions, cuttings from fruit trees, wrapped in damp burlap. They spent a week together, grafting apple and pear varieties onto rootstock that Clara had selected for shade tolerance. She also brought seeds, varieties of kale, chard, and lettuce that German market gardeners used in cold frames, perfectly suited to the mine's conditions. By the third visit, in January of 1857, neither of them was pretending the visits were purely botanical. "I've never met a man who listened to plants the way you do," Clara said. They were sitting in the main chamber, the oil lamp casting amber light across their faces, the mine breathing its warm breath around them. "Most men listen to other men. You listen to the mountain." "The mountain has better things to say," Ezra replied. She laughed, a sound that rang off the limestone walls and filled spaces that Ezra hadn't known were empty. They married in April of 1857, in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Asbury at the entrance to the mine, with dogwood blossoms falling around them and the warm exhalation of the mountain at their backs. The ceremony was small. Clara's mother came from Middlesbrough, along with her younger brother Hans and 2 neighbor women who had befriended Clara. From Ezra's side, there was no one but Asbury, which might have been sad, except that Ezra didn't experience it that way. The mountain was there, and the hollow was there, and the garden was there, and now Clara was there. That was family enough. Clara moved into the mine, and within a month she had reorganized the growing beds, introduced a composting system, and started a detailed botanical catalog of every species growing underground. She also transformed the living space in ways that Ezra, who had lived alone for 8 years, hadn't thought to attempt. She hung dried herbs from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of lavender and rosemary. She sewed curtains for the entrance doorway from fabric she'd brought from Middlesbrough. A small thing, perhaps, but the first purely decorative object the mine had ever contained. She insisted on a proper dining table, which Ezra built from a slab of cherry wood so beautiful that he spent 3 days sanding and oiling it before he'd let her set a plate on it. They fell into a rhythm that was part partnership, part conversation, part gentle competition. Clara would propose an experiment, a new soil mixture, a different planting depth, a novel approach to light distribution, and Ezra would build whatever structure was needed to test it. He deferred to her botanical knowledge without resentment, and she deferred to his understanding of the mountain's moods and mechanics without condescension. In the evenings, they read to each other. She from her German botanical texts, translating as she went, and he from the American Agriculturist, or whatever book he'd acquired most recently. Together, they were formidable. The years of their partnership transformed the mine from a remarkable curiosity into something approaching a wonder. Clara's formal botanical knowledge complemented Ezra's intuitive understanding of the mountain. Where he worked by feel, she worked by system. She established controlled growing experiments, comparing varieties, testing soil amendments, measuring growth rates, and recorded everything in a series of journals that would eventually fill an entire shelf. She also brought social connections that Ezra, by temperament and circumstance, had never developed. Through her father's botanical network and her own correspondence, word of the Blind Hollow mine garden reached scientists, horticulturists, and journalists across the eastern states. In 1858, an article appeared in the American Agriculturist, not Ezra's beloved subscription copy, but the publication itself. The article, titled Subterranean Agriculture in the Kentucky Mountains, was written by Dr. Marsh and described the mine garden in detail. It generated a flurry of interest that brought visitors to Blind Hollow throughout the summer and fall. Most visitors were merely curious. A few were skeptical, convinced the whole thing was a hoax, until they descended into the mountain and saw tomatoes ripening by lamplight in November. But several were genuinely interested in the agricultural applications, and from these visits came opportunities. A seed company in Philadelphia paid Ezra $50 for the right to test his mineral-rich soil mixture as a growing medium. A herbalist from Cincinnati established a standing order for his underground ginseng, which had developed a reputation for unusual potency, a reputation that was, for once, grounded in reality, as the slow-growing roots in the mine's consistent conditions developed higher concentrations of the active compounds that made ginseng valuable. By 1860, Ezra and Clara were earning over $300 a year, a comfortable income by rural Kentucky standards, entirely from the mine's produce. They had expanded the living quarters to include a proper kitchen with a cast-iron Dutch oven Clara had brought from her family's homestead, a sitting room with a wood stove for the occasional supplemental warmth, and a bedroom with a real bedstead that Ezra had built from walnut. The walls of the sitting room were lined with shelves that held their growing library, scientific journals, botanical references, Clara's German-language novels, and Ezra's well-worn Walden, its spine cracked and its margins full of penciled notes. Their first child, a boy named Amos after Ezra's grandfather, was born in February of 1860 in the warmest room in Harlan County. The child was born underground, in a chamber that held steady at 68 degrees, while a blizzard raged above. Clara, attended by a midwife from Middlesbrough, delivered the boy by lamplight, while Ezra waited in the main passage, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the terrified joy of becoming a father. When the midwife placed the infant in his arms, Ezra looked down at the small red face and thought of his own mother and his grandfather, and the chain of stubbornness and love that had brought him to this place. Amos Crenshaw II came into the world in a place that the earth had warmed for millennia before his arrival. He would not be the last. The Civil War came to Kentucky in 1861, and it came with particular cruelty to the mountains, where neighbors who had lived peaceably for decades found themselves on opposite sides. Harlan County was divided, Union sympathizers in the hollows, Confederate leaners in the towns, and the violence was personal in a way that the great battles to the north and east were not. Ezra did not fight. At 28, with a wife, an infant son, and a farm that existed entirely underground, he had both the means and the motivation to avoid the conflict. Blind Hollow's remoteness, which had once been his isolation, became his protection. No recruiting sergeant hiked up the creek bed through the laurel thicket. No foraging party found the hidden entrance to his mine. But the war touched them nonetheless. Food prices soared. Salt became almost unavailable. Trade routes that had connected Ezra to his ginseng buyers and seed suppliers were disrupted or destroyed. For 4 years, the Crenshaws turned inward, living almost entirely from the mine's production and the surrounding forest, much as Ezra had during his first desperate months. They didn't merely survive. They quietly fed others. Ezra and Clara, with their year-round underground garden, had food when their neighbors did not. Throughout the war years, Ezra would leave bundles of greens, mushrooms, and root vegetables at the head of the trail where Blind Hollow met the main creek road. He never waited to see who took them. He never kept account. Clara packed the bundles, and Ezra carried them down in the gray light before dawn, and in the morning they were always gone. Years later, when the war was over and the accounting of debts and gratitudes began, a surprising number of Harlan County families would acknowledge that they'd survived a hard winter because of food that appeared, as if by magic, at the mouth of Blind Hollow. A woman named Martha Sizemore told her grandchildren that during the winter of 1863, when her husband was away fighting and her children were sick with fever, she found a bundle at the trailhead that contained fresh greens, dried mushrooms, a jar of pickled beets, and a small cloth bag of dried ginseng for tea. She never knew who left it. She didn't need to. Ezra never spoke of it. Purpose was a stronger medicine than rest, and feeding others gave him purpose when the world seemed bent on destruction. The decades after the war were the years of fruition. Between 1866 and 1890, Ezra expanded the mine garden to a scale that astonished everyone who saw it. The growing area eventually encompassed over 4,000 square feet of cultivated underground space, spread across the main shaft and 6 lateral chambers. 8 light wells brought sunlight to strategic points. The water channeling system, refined over 20 years, provided reliable irrigation to every growing bed. A ventilation system of Ezra's own design, using the mine's natural thermal draft, supplemented by strategically placed baffles and vents, kept air circulating and prevented the mold and stagnation that plagued other underground spaces. The transformation of the mine during these decades was not merely agricultural, but architectural. Ezra, with Clara's help and occasional hired labor from the valley below, turned the raw passages into something that visitors consistently described as beautiful. The main living areas were plastered with a lime and clay mixture that Clara had developed, giving the walls a smooth, cream-colored surface that reflected lamplight warmly. Stone archways framed the transitions between rooms. Wooden doors, each one hand-built from local hardwood, hung on iron hinges that Ezra forged himself after teaching himself basic blacksmithing from a manual Clara had ordered from a bookshop in Louisville. The floors in the living quarters were laid with flat limestone flags, fitted together with the precision of a mason and covered in places with rag rugs that Clara and later Catherine wove during winter evenings. The kitchen became Clara's particular domain, a stone hearth with a proper chimney, vented through one of the abandoned light well shafts, allowed for real cooking. She installed a root cellar within the root cellar, a deeper alcove where temperatures reached 72 degrees, and where she kept fermenting crocks of sauerkraut, kimchi-like preparations she'd learned from a Korean railroad worker who passed through Middlesboro, and vinegar mothers that produced apple cider vinegar from their own orchard's fruit. The smells of that kitchen, warm bread, fermenting vegetables, drying herbs, became the defining scent of the Crenshaw home, and their children would recall it decades later with a vividness that surprised them. He grew over 60 varieties of plants. His underground orchard, 7 dwarf fruit trees grafted onto shade-tolerant rootstock by Clara's method, produced apples, pears, and cherries in quantities that would have embarrassed many surface orchards. His mushroom cultivation expanded to include 6 different species, grown on inoculated logs stacked in the deepest chambers. His ginseng operation alone generated several $100s annually, but it was the winter produce that made his reputation. In an era before refrigerated rail cars and year-round shipping from California, fresh vegetables in a Kentucky winter were essentially non-existent. Ezra Crenshaw could provide them. By the 1870s, he was supplying fresh greens, herbs, and mushrooms to 3 general stores, 2 hotels in Middlesboro, and a growing list of private customers who would send a boy up the mountain with cash and come back with baskets of food that shouldn't have existed in January. The income was substantial. By 1880, Ezra estimated his annual revenue at over $900, a figure that put him among the more prosperous residents of Harlan County, despite the fact that he lived in what the county assessor still officially classified as a cave dwelling. More importantly, the mine had become a destination. Scientists, agriculturists, journalists, and the merely curious made the trek to Blind Hollow in a steady trickle. Ezra, who had spent his first years in the mine in near total solitude, became an unlikely teacher. He gave tours, explained his methods, and shared seeds and techniques with anyone who asked. He never charged for the knowledge. "The mountain taught me for free," he told a reporter from the Lexington Herald in 1882. "I won't charge for passing it along." 3 more children followed Amos. Catherine, born in 1862 and named for Ezra's mother. Wilhelm, born in 1865 and named for Clara's father. And Rosemary, born in 1869 and named for the herb that grew with astonishing vigor in the mine's entrance garden. They grew up underground, which sounded stranger than it was. The mine, by the time of Rosemary's birth, was a comfortable and spacious home, warm in winter, cool in summer, quiet and safe. The children explored the passages like other children explored woods and fields. They played hide-and-seek in the lateral chambers, naming each alcove and crevice with the proprietary confidence of young explorers. Amos, the eldest, claimed the deepest passage as his laboratory and spent hours examining rock formations with a magnifying glass Dr. Marsh had sent as a gift. Catherine collected pressed flowers and leaves, creating herbarium sheets that she stored in the driest section of the mine, already mimicking her mother's meticulous cataloging methods. Wilhelm, the most social of the 4, would hike down to the valley to trade with other children, always returning with some new treasure, a fishing hook, a piece of colored glass, a story about what the world beyond Blind Hollow was doing. They learned to garden before they learned to read, though they learned both. Clara was a demanding teacher who held evening classes by lamplight in the main chamber, and all 4 children could read, write, and perform arithmetic before they set foot in the county schoolhouse. The schoolhouse itself was something of a shock, not for the children, who adapted readily, but for the other students, who had never met anyone who lived inside a mountain and could name 60 species of edible plants, but had never seen a horse-drawn plow used in a proper field. Each child, as Ezra would reflect in later years, took a different piece of what the mine had taught their parents. Amos inherited his father's quiet patience and mechanical skill. He would eventually become an engineer who designed ventilation systems for coal mines, improving safety for thousands of miners across Appalachia. Catherine had Clara's botanical mind and would study at Berea College, becoming one of the first women in Kentucky to earn a degree in natural science. Wilhelm had an entrepreneurial spirit and would establish a mushroom cultivation business in Tennessee that operated for 40 years. Rosemary, the youngest, became a schoolteacher who taught a generation of mountain children that curiosity was more valuable than wealth. None of them were mocked. None of them were cast out. They carried their parents' values into the world, like seeds carried on the wind. And where they landed, things grew. News of Harold Pruitt reached Ezra occasionally, in fragments carried by the slow currents of mountain gossip. Harold's farm had declined steadily through the 1850s. The soil, worked without rest or amendment, grew thin and bitter. The fences sagged. The barn roof leaked and was never repaired. Dale, the older son, had left for the goldfields of California in 1852 and was never heard from again, lost presumably to the vast indifference of the frontier. Emmett had stayed and drunk heavily, a habit that served him poorly when a disagreement over a fence line turned violent in 1858. He survived the altercation, but lost the use of his right arm, and after that, he sat on the same porch where his father had sat and drank corn whiskey until the days blurred together. Harold himself sold the farm, including the 40 acres that had belonged to Ezra's mother, in 1863, for a price that local gossip described as embarrassingly low. He moved to a boarding house in Harlan and died there in 1871, alone, of causes that the county doctor recorded as general debility, but that everyone understood meant drink and despair. Ezra learned of Harold's death from Reverend Asbury, who was by then an old man himself, still making the occasional hike to Blind Hollow. Ezra listened to the news, nodded, and said nothing. He did not visit the grave. He did not feel triumph. He felt something quieter and sadder. The recognition that Harold Pruitt had been given more than most men start with, and had made less of it than almost anyone could have, while Ezra had been given nothing and had built everything. There was no satisfaction in that comparison, only a kind of tired understanding. Ezra went back into the mine and tended his garden. That was the only answer he'd ever needed. Clara died in 1891 of pneumonia at the age of 58. She died in the main chamber, in the bed that Ezra had built from walnut, with the mine breathing its warm breath around her and the sound of water seeping softly down the limestone walls. Her botanical journals, 7 volumes, each one filled with her precise handwriting and detailed illustrations of leaf patterns, root structures, and growth charts, sat on the shelf beside the bed. Her last words to Ezra were about the grafted cherry tree in the Third Light Well garden. "The Montmorency is ready for harvest," she whispered. Don't let the fruit drop. Ezra harvested the cherries the next morning, weeping as he worked, his tears falling into the warm soil of the underground garden that they had built together over 34 years. He processed the fruit into preserves, labeling each jar with the date and variety in Clara's honor, using the precise notation she had taught him. He lived on for 7 more years, tending the mine garden alone after the children had grown and scattered. He was slower now, his joints stiff and his hair gone white, but his routine was unbroken. Every morning he walked the growing beds, checking moisture levels, inspecting plants, making notes in his journal. Every evening he sat in the main chamber with a lamp and a book, the mountain warm and steady around him. And he would sometimes speak aloud to Clara, as though she were still sitting in the chair across the table, reading one of her German novels, looking up to tell him something about nitrogen fixation or the fruiting cycle of shiitake. Visitors still came. A professor from the University of Kentucky toured the mine in 1894 and described it in a letter to a colleague as the most remarkable example of vernacular geothermal engineering in the eastern United States. A photographer from a Cincinnati newspaper took images that same year, the first photographs of the mine garden, showing an elderly man standing among rows of green plants deep inside a mountain, lamplight glowing off limestone walls, looking for all the world like a prophet in a cathedral. Ezra Crenshaw died on January 12, 1898, at the age of 65. He died in the mine, in his bed, in a room that held 68 degrees, while the outside temperature was 4 below zero. His son Amos found him the following morning, peaceful, his journal open on the bedside table. The last entry, written in a shaky but legible hand, read, "Mushroom logs, in passage 6, need turning. Bean seeds in the lower beds are ready for spring planting. Temperature steady. The mountain is still warm. There is always more to find." They buried him beside Clara, on the hillside above the mine entrance, where the dogwoods bloom every April, and the warm air rising from the mountain keeps the ground soft, even in the coldest winters. The children came from their scattered lives, Amos from Lexington, Catherine from Berea, Wilhelm from Tennessee, Rosemary from the schoolhouse down the valley, and they stood together in the January cold, the warm breath of the mine rising behind them like a sigh, and they said goodbye to the man who had taught them that the world gives you what you're willing to look for. The mine garden continued in diminished form for another generation. Amos maintained the core growing beds during visits from his home in Lexington, and Wilhelm sent workers from Tennessee to tend the mushroom logs. Catherine cataloged her mother's botanical journals and donated copies to the university library. Rosemary brought her school children to the mine every spring, teaching them about geothermal heat and underground agriculture and the stubbornness of a boy who refused to stop when the world told him he was nothing. But the enterprise slowly wound down as the children built their own lives elsewhere, and by the 1920s, the mine stood largely dormant. It was rediscovered in 1952 by a geology student from the University of Kentucky who was surveying abandoned mines in the Black Mountain area. He found the light wells, the growing beds, the water channels, all still intact, though overgrown. Most remarkably, he found mushrooms still growing on logs that had been inoculated decades earlier, sustained by the mine's unchanging warmth and moisture. Nature had continued Ezra's work long after human hands had stopped. The mine was documented, studied, and eventually listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978 as the Crenshaw Geothermal Agricultural Site. Modern analysis confirmed what Dr. Marsh had hypothesized over a century earlier. The site sits atop a natural geothermal anomaly where deep earth heat is channeled upward through fractured limestone creating a stable underground microclimate that is, in fact, ideally suited to year-round agriculture. Researchers from several universities have since studied the site extensively. The soil in Ezra's growing beds, even after decades without cultivation, tested remarkably fertile, rich in the calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus that the limestone seepage had deposited over half a century of continuous irrigation. The light wells, though partially collapsed, were recognized as an innovative solution to the fundamental problem of subterranean agriculture. One agricultural engineer, writing in a 2003 journal article, called them a pre-industrial precursor to modern fiber optic daylighting systems, and noted that Ezra's angled, reflective-lined shafts operated on the same principles that contemporary architects use to bring natural light into underground structures. Clara's botanical journals, preserved by Catherine and eventually donated to the University of Kentucky's special collections, proved equally valuable. Her meticulous records of growth rates, soil compositions, and seasonal variations across 40 years of underground farming constituted one of the most detailed long-term agricultural datasets from 19th century Appalachia. Researchers studying the effects of stable temperature environments on plant growth cited her work well into the 21st century. Perhaps most remarkably, the mine's geothermal system still functions. Visitors to the site today. It is open to the public by appointment, maintained by a trust established by Ezra's great-grandchildren, report the same phenomenon that Ezra experienced on his first night in 1849. The air grows warm as you walk deeper. The walls radiate a gentle heat. The seepage still flows, clear and mineral sweet, into the same stone basin where a 16-year-old boy once drank his first clean water in days. The mountain is still breathing. Today, the concept that Ezra Crenshaw stumbled upon at 16, using the Earth's own heat to grow food underground, is studied under the name geothermal greenhouse agriculture and is practiced in Iceland, Japan, and parts of the American West. Engineers build sophisticated systems to achieve what Ezra achieved with a knife, a hammer, and the patience to listen to a mountain. But none of those systems have quite the character of Blind Hollow. None of them were built by a boy with nothing. None of them were born from the marriage of desperation and curiosity, from the simple observation that the earth was warm and the willingness to ask what that warmth could become. Ezra Crenshaw never sought revenge on those who cast him out. He never built a monument to his own success. He built a garden inside a mountain, fed his family and his neighbors, raised children who carried his values into the world, and died in a room that the earth itself kept warm. There is always more to find. He believed that to the end, and the mountain, breathing its ancient breath, warm and patient and enduring, agreed.